Alright guys, we're here with the final video in cell respiration, and even though we have covered all of the processes of cell respiration, we've talked about the process of glycolysis and the Krebs cycle and the electron transport chain and oxidative phosphorylation. We've talked about how we actually get a majority of our ATP and all these other things. We talked about the importance of oxygen as well in this process, and the fact that it's so important that it is listed in the chemical reaction for cell respiration. But what happens if this process does not have any access to oxygen? Okay, how does glycolysis or cell respiration attempt to proceed in the absence of oxygen? Okay, what we need to do to understand why what the process is of continuing in the absence of oxygen, we have to review a little bit about our oxidizing agent. Okay, if you recall, the oxidizing agent of glycolysis was, and really all of cell respiration, was NAD+, right? NAD+ takes the high energy electrons off of the broken apart sugar molecules at different stages and then brings them to the electron transport chain, drops them off, and then you get the whole bit, and then you finally get some ATP, and ultimately those electrons end up in oxygen, right? And so what we need to understand is what happens when there is no oxygen. How is NAD+ regenerated? Like, NAD+ is a vital thing to keeping glycolysis and thus pretty much all of cell respiration running, right? NAD+ takes those electrons in the Krebs cycle as well. It takes them in the link reaction. So NAD+ is really important. But once NAD+ gains those electrons, it turns into NADH, and then it drops them off the electron transport chain. And that's what we have to understand here, is that NADH, once it drops those electrons off of the electron transport chain, it will convert back to NAD+. But this won't happen, this process right here will not happen if there is no oxygen. If there's no oxygen, there's nothing that those electrons are going to be drawn to. The oxygen is so electronegative that it will basically just suck those electrons right off of NADH, and more or less suck them all the way through the electron transport chain. That's a way that you can think of it, okay? And as a result, we see that, with the pointer out here, we see that NAD+ is regenerated as a result. Now if we go all the way back, let's see if we can go all the way back here to, glycolysis, right? We start to see in glycolysis, this is our first instance of NADH, or pardon me, NAD+ grabbing some high energy electrons to create NADH. And then even in the Krebs cycle, which we talked about, we see a bunch of NADH created. But the only reason it's created is because there's NAD+ there. And NAD+ has to be regenerated in the electron transport chain. And if there's no oxygen, the electron transport chain will not regenerate NAD+. So we have this kind of quandary. What happens in the absence of oxygen? Oxygen takes those electrons that were dropped off by NAD+, and as a result, it regenerates the NAD+. So how does that NAD+, which is so vitally important to at least two of the main phases of cell respiration, how does it become regenerated in the absence of that oxygen, which is one of the things that helped regenerate it in the first place? That's what we're going to jump into here. We're going to jump into a process known as fermentation. Okay, and so this diagram that you see in front of us kind of gives you a little pathway, and it shows you, okay, what happens? What happens? We've got glucose in the cytosol. Glucose goes through glycolysis. It turns into pyruvate, and then pyruvate, depending on whether or not there's oxygen, will go either into the mitochondria. It'll take place in the Krebs cycle, and the mitochondria will create ATP as a result. Okay? Or if there's no oxygen, that pyruvate stays in the cytosol, and it will go through a process known as fermentation. Okay? Now there's two different types of fermentation. There is a type of fermentation called alcohol fermentation, And alcohol fermentation is actually one of the primary ways that some organisms get their energy. Okay, for instance, yeast. Yeast is an organism that undergoes alcohol fermentation. And yeast, just like us, undergoes glycolysis, the process of glycolysis. Okay? And so what we see here is the process of fermentation laid out in front of us. And I want to introduce this process of fermentation here because not only is this the main way that yeast gets its energy, but it also doubles as an effective way for yeast to regenerate NAD+, the electron acceptor. Okay, so I'm going to draw on this a little bit here. Get rid of that, get rid of this. Okay, so we would think in yeast cells, we have our glucose molecule, which is right here. It's this 6-carbon strand that you see. It undergoes glycolysis, so like we know in glycolysis, we get a net production of 2 ATP, right? We invest 2 and then we get 4 out of the energy payoff phase, so a net production of 2. We get 2 NADHs as well, and we get 2 pyruvic acids. This is also known as pyruvate, okay? Everything about glycolysis in yeast is the exact same as glycolysis in humans, okay? Now the next step, yeast does not undergo the next step, the steps that we ultimately do. For yeast, what they're going to do is take this pyruvic acid and they're going to undergo this process known as fermentation, which we're talking about, okay? So we're going to release carbon dioxide, okay? Since there's 2 pyruvic acids, we release 2 carbon dioxides, okay? So one of these carbons would leave off of the structure of pyruvic acid. And we would take the NADHs that were produced here, okay? And we're basically going to break those down again. We're going to add on some of the high energy electrons that were on NADH. We're going to add them back into the existing or the resulting molecule after CO2 is left. And then we're going to regenerate that NAD+, okay? As a result, the end product of alcohol fermentation, or one of the byproducts, is known as ethanol. And we've talked about ethanol before, right? Ethanol is the stuff you put in beer, okay? And this is one of the main reasons you see yeast used in the brewing of beer. If you go into many, many different types of breweries, they will talk to you about, oh, we put the yeast in, and this is what happens, this is what the yeast does. And the yeast is responsible for the bubbly, okay, which is the CO2, and also, if you're 21, the fun, okay, the ethanol. And so when these alcoholic drinks are brewed, or at least like beer, they put yeast in some of them, and the byproducts of yeast are CO2 and ethanol, okay? And that's what kind of makes beer beer. Otherwise, it's just kind of gross tasting water, right? And what we really need to make sure we pay attention to here is that we get this NAD plus regenerated, okay? And that NAD plus, I think this diagram would have benefited from another arrow, okay? That NAD plus can be regenerated to be reused in glycolysis, and then the whole entire thing can start over again. So this is an effective way for little teeny tiny little yeast cells to utilize their energy, to utilize their glucose, and make energy. Okay, it's just kind of constant as long as there's a product in the glucose, or pardon me, a reactant in the glucose, and a way for all of these ATPs and NADHs to be created. The yeast will have this constant cycle. It will continuously regenerate the NAD+. The second this NAD+ does not get regenerated is the second that the yeast cell dies. Okay, and I can put death of the yeast cell. So if the NAD+ is not being regenerated, the yeast cell dies. Now, let's kind of let's extend that a little bit and talk briefly, if I can find the cursor, there it is, about lactic acid fermentation. Lactic acid fermentation happens in the muscle cells of human beings, and it makes ATP when oxygen is scarce. But a more important byproduct of lactic acid fermentation is the fact that it regenerates NAD+. So when your body is low on oxygen, you're huffing and puffing from a big workout, or you're playing a competition game or whatever, football, basketball, soccer, whatever it is, volleyball, softball. I could name them all. I'm just trying to be equal there. When you do these competitions or when you exert yourself physically, you're huffing and puffing and you're struggling for air. Your muscle cells are going to revert to this kind of primitive way of staying alive, okay? They don't have enough oxygen for the mass production of ATP by way of the electron transport chain and oxidative phosphorylation in the mitochondria. So what they're going to do is revert to this primitive way to make sure that they stay alive. This is like last-ditch effort pathway for cells, because they realize, oh my gosh, there's very little oxygen left. We need to revert to this way that's going to make sure we keep us alive. And so, in some ways, it works very similar to how the yeast cells would do it. Okay, so if our bodies are, we'll say, low on oxygen. Oh, this is not the one I can draw on. All right, let's say we're low on O2 at this point here. We've made our pyruvic acid or our pyruvates. We've undergone glycolysis the best we have, but our body realizes, oh my gosh, we're huffing and puffing, gross, right? And we can't get enough oxygen. Our muscle cells are going to start to revert to lactic acid fermentation, and instead of taking these NADHs to the electron transport chain, what they're going to do is they're going to basically add those high energy electrons back into the pyruvic acid, and it's going to create a different type of molecule called lactic acid. Okay? But the critical thing here is that we have regenerated our NAD+, okay? So it can be reused in glycolysis, and we can continue to create little bits of ATP as a result. And this is what's keeping us alive. Okay? Now, if we don't stop and get oxygen soon, we will die. We will run out of the ability to even do that. And so the NAD+ will stop being regenerated, and then we die. Okay? Now, as long as we continue to make this lactic acid, as long as we continue to make that lactic acid, we're going to continue to be able to make NAD+, which is going to continue to be recycled into glycolysis, which helps us to continuously make ATP. As long as we're doing that, we're still going to be alive. Now, you may feel the effects of this, okay? Once you've slowed down, once you've kind of caught your breath and had a chance to rest, maybe you start to realize, oh my gosh, my muscles are killing me. My muscles are really, really sore. And that is a result of the buildup of the lactic acid. That lactic acid is not normally supposed to be in your muscle cells, and it has an adverse effect on your cells, and you can feel it. It causes this burning feeling, and then a couple days later, it makes it so your muscles are really, really sore, and that's because you've had this lactic acid buildup. So anytime you get that burning feeling, that sore feeling, what that is that's lactic acid interacting with probably like nerve receptors somewhere located in your muscles, in your muscle tissue. Okay, and it's a warning for you to say, okay, you're low on oxygen. Let's stop and take a break, catch a breath, and then we can go ahead and make ATP like we normally would. Okay, so this is an important thing to understand when we're talking about a process like cell respiration that requires massive amounts of oxygen. We really have to understand what happens when the one thing that keeps it going, oxygen. Oh bugger! It flipped right to my Christmas music when I plug that back in. We have to understand what is going on when we're low on that oxygen that keeps the entire system going. It turns out we do in fact have kind of a last-ditch effort for our bodies to stay alive until we can find a situation where we will get more oxygen. And more often than not, it happens, right? We take a rest, we get a break, and our body reverts back to normal, okay? But it's got this kind of alternative mode, if you want to call it that keeps you alive in strenuous circumstances. So it begs the question, or maybe it doesn't beg the question, which one is better, respiration or fermentation? It's quite obvious that respiration is by far. If you undergo normal respiration at normal circumstances, you get 38 ATP per glucose molecule, right? And that far exceeds the 2 that you would get from fermentation. But fermentation does have its upside, and the fact that it regenerates that NAD+, so that you can continue glycolysis until the situation that you happen to find yourself in improves, right? You can find some oxygen or get a rest. And so that NAD+ can be reused over and over again as long as you can continue to regenerate it, okay? And that is through fermentation. So fermentation does have some drastic downfalls. You would never want to try and run your entire body on the ATP that fermentation gives you, but it does have the really pretty good advantage that it keeps you alive, right? And that's always a good advantage. So we just kind of had to get that out of the way. It didn't really relate a whole lot to a lot of the other information we had talked about, so I wanted to cover it in its own little video, okay? Now this final diagram I keep in here, and I always put it at the end because this diagram illustrates the fact that it's not just sugar in terms of glucose that we can break down to get energy from, okay? And I mentioned this in one of the very first videos, that when you see the chemical reaction for cell respiration, you see C6H12O6 plus oxygen yields CO2, water, and some energy. That's the famous one. You always see that one, right? And the reason for that is because glucose is one of the most numerous compounds on the face of the planet because plants make it, right? But it's not the only thing that we can break down for energy, okay? We break down fats for energy all the time. We break down proteins for energy all the time. Those are things that, you know, if you eat meat, heck, if you eat beans, beans have fats and proteins as well. So regardless of whether or not you're a vegan, a vegetarian, or a meat-eating carnivore, omnivore person, you're getting all of these macromolecules. You're getting carbohydrates, you're getting fats, you're getting proteins. And all of these things can be broken down in some instance for energy. And I find it very interesting when I look at this diagram. We're not going to get into the specifics of how this happens, but if we eat some fat, for instance, part of fats is something known as glycerol. This is a chapter 5 thing. Remember I said it was super important? Glycerol happens to be an intermediate that will basically interject itself right in here to the process of glycolysis. Okay, it can be turned into glyceraldehyde 3-phosphate, G3P. So glycerol can be turned into G3P. Components of the fatty acids can ultimately be turned into acetyl-CoA. Okay. Other parts of amino acids can be turned into pyruvate, can be turned into acetyl-CoA or some other intermediate of the Krebs cycle. And so you can interject all of these different intermediates. If you break apart proteins, if you break apart fats, all of these little molecules, are these big molecules that were put together before, and they're massive, right? You can chop them up into little bits, and you can throw the pieces into the different parts of cell respiration. And throw them into glycolysis and get you some glyceraldehyde 3-phosphate. Throw them into the link reaction and maybe get some acetyl-CoA. Throw them into the Krebs cycle and you get maybe, what is it, mannitol, or some kind of crazy one in there. You know, you get these intermediates if you break apart these other large macromolecules. And, you know, you see this a lot, whether you think about it or not. You see it in a couple different places. You see it, people who are anorexic, for instance, people who starve themselves, people who diet, okay? I lost almost 30 pounds over the course of the last 2 or 3 years on purpose, okay? It was, you know, I did that on purpose. But I can definitely tell a difference in my muscle mass, right? My proteins. That's what makes up your muscle. I've seen my body get rid of some of that. It basically eats it, okay? Fats. I lost fat, okay? I witnessed fat go off of my body and go somewhere else. And that's because I had taken in less calories, and as a result, my body was going through the stores of things that it had on it to get through the day, okay? And so you see that same type of thing with people with anorexia. You see it with, it's very sad, dying cancer patients as well. You hear people who know somebody who's anorexic, and they say, well, that person's skin and bones, and it almost is that. Okay, they've burned through all of the carbohydrates that they might have eaten that day, which may be very few. And then, since their body was still starving for energy to try and live, okay, that's default mode, obviously, for the body. I don't know if you knew that, is to keep you alive. It's going to start to eat through the fat stores that the person has. Once all the fat's gone, they're going to start to eat through the proteins. Okay, so you see people who are anorexic be very, very skinny. They have no muscle mass. And then once all the muscles are gone, they're going to start to eat away at the vital organs. Okay, and that's ultimately what people with anorexia die from is organ failure, because their body is almost literally, I can't say literally because there's not like mouth in there eating the organs, but the cells are eating themselves. Okay, the organs are eating themselves. They're breaking down. They're trying to digest anything that they can to live. I witnessed this with my stepfather a couple years ago, who passed away of pancreatic cancer, and I will never forget what the hospice nurse said, that he was kind of bedridden at that point. It was nearing the end of his life, but he hadn't eaten in probably a week or two, anything. He was getting IV fluids, and that's about it. And she said, well, he's still producing stools, right? He's still going to the bathroom number 2. And I'm thinking to myself, well, why is that? And then it dawned on me that his body was eating itself, and it was heartbreaking. It's one of those things that you just don't think about, that the body shouldn't be able to produce stool if it's not taking anything in, like eating, but it was still producing stool because the body was eating itself. And if there's anything to be learned from that, and this is my public service announcement for the day, is that the body wants you to stay alive. Okay, in many ways, that's what it does. It has a default mode. It has a default setting, and there's oftentimes not anything you can do about it. That the body wants you to stay alive. So do what you can to help it out. Okay. That'll do it for cell respiration. I hope you're not too thoroughly confused. If you are, by all means, make sure you get a hold of me, and I will try to work anything out that I can for you. Okay. Have a good one, guys.